Hey there, and welcome back to the Elder Scrolls and Philosophy. If you've not already done so, then make sure that you go back and watch the last video that I made in this series on the Elder Scrolls creation myth, in which I really walk through this myth from using in-universe sources. You're going to be getting some of that again in this video, but really broken up, because in this video what I'm doing is I'm going to be providing an analysis of that myth, relating the Elder Scrolls myth to creation stories that we talk about from our primary world. And so we're going to talk some mythology, we're going to talk some philosophy, we're going to talk some theology, sort of all wrapped together here. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to play my telling of the creation myth again, but I'm going to keep interrupting myself. And so it'll be helpful if you see the full streamlined version before you do this. And just like with last time, if you are listening through the podcast over on Mythic Mind Games, then, then by all means, listen to the podcast, right? Keep listening. But this is going to be a bit better with the visuals. And so at some point when you're able to, make sure you click that YouTube link and watch the video. This is the last part of my introductory unit to the course. And this is the last part that, at least for now, is going to be publicly available. And so if you want to continue with us, then head over to patreon.com/mythicmind, become a tier 3 patron, whether annually or monthly, and you'll be able to join the study. And we're about to start the week of October 19th, 2025. And so if you want to join us live, which makes it a lot more fun, then this is the time to do that. But all right, now let's go ahead and get into my analysis of the creation myth from the Elder Scrolls. In the beginning were Anu and Padomay, order and chaos. Even more primordial than what we would call gods, Anu and Padomay stand for form as such, and void as such. Alright, now in beginning with order and chaos, we're dealing with some archetypal realities that we find at the foundation of a great many creation myths. For example, in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, we begin with two primordial forces, Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu is associated with order and with fresh water. And so even Apsu and Anu, they sound kind of similar here. And so Apsu stands for order. And then you have Tiamat, which stands for chaos and is associated with salt water. Apsu is masculine, Tiamat is feminine. And you find this very often in mythologies, that the masculine is associated with order and the feminine is associated with chaos. And no, ladies, I'm not saying that you're crazy, but the idea here is that typically it's order that asserts itself, it's chaos that receives order, because to be chaotic is to be formless, right? And so the formless, the chaotic, receives order and then gives rise to new life. And so masculine order asserts itself and provides something that feminine chaos receives, and out of that we get the birth of new life. And I don't think I really need to spell out how that works on an organic level, but I'm really focusing on the archetypal level here, and that's why order and chaos are often gendered in the way that they are. And so we see this in the Babylonian story with Apsu and with Tiamat. And as the waters, so to speak, of Apsu and Tiamat meld together, it gives birth to the gods, which then get really rambunctious and annoying. The chaos of the gods upsets Apsu, the stand-in for order as such, so Apsu begins plotting their demise, but the gods instead strike first. And so the gods kill their father Apsu, and then they live on his corpse. And so now we see that the gods, sort of as a second level of chaos, as we see through their actions, they establish a kind of order by living on the corpse of their father. And there's a lot that we can do with that, but that's going to take us a little bit afield of the central Elder Scrolls myth that we're dealing with here. And now, in retaliation for killing Apsu, Tiamat now plans to get vengeance on the gods, on her own children, the godkins. And so she intends to send this flood of monsters, of dragons and serpents, these symbols of chaos, as well as like a literal flood to wipe out the gods. But one of the gods, the chief among the gods, is named Marduk. Now Marduk has eyes all over his head, which points to the fact that he's all-knowing, he's omniscient, and he's able to use magic words to manifest reality. And so this omniscient God, who's able to manifest reality by speaking the true word, is able to defeat Tiamat, the primordial deity of chaos, and then out of her body, he makes the world that we now inhabit. And so the omniscient God creates order out of chaos by speaking the true word, and in so doing, he creates this mortal plane in which we live. And humanity is created in this myth as the gods take the blood of Kingu, one of Tiamat's lover and advisor, and out of this divine blood makes humanity in order to serve the needs of the gods. And so we mortals are nothing more than servants of the god, doing the things for them that they just don't really want to do themselves. And honestly, in my reading, at least generally speaking, I don't know it would be entirely incorrect to make a comparison between these Babylonian gods and say the Daedra, or at least the gods more broadly speaking in the Elder Scrolls universe. And then shifting gears a little bit from mythology proper to sort of philosophical mythology, consider Plato's creation account in the Timaeus, in which he talks about God, the craftsman, seeing the chaotic, the formless material world, and then applying to this formless and chaotic world the eternal forms, which are kind of like the blueprint for existence, the ideal way that things are. And so in Plato's creation account, he takes the world that is formless and void, he applies mind, he applies the ideals, the eternal realm of the forms, to this chaotic world, and thereby fashions it in accordance with the way that things ought to be. However, according to Plato, the material world has inherent chaos about it. It's given over to entropy. Things naturally fall apart. Things are naturally corrupted. Things are necessarily corrupted. Like, even at their best, earthly things are but copies of the original. And as you know, if you've ever made copies of anything, right, you throw it in the scanner and print it out, it's never going to be exactly the same as the original. And even if it gets to a point where you have a great copier, to the point where maybe your eye can't tell a difference, even still it's a derivation, it is derivative of the original, thereby making it ontologically inferior to what is more foundational in the original. And so the original is always going to be superior to the copy. And so what these material copies of these eternal realities do is they continually move. The world, which moves in accordance with its spirit, moves in eternal approximation to the stable forms of ideal reality. Imagine if you had a perfectly uniform sphere and it's spinning. Well, if it's perfectly uniform and it's spinning, then you wouldn't even really know that it is spinning, right? It would have the appearance of stability. And so that's why, according to Plato, the material world is constantly in motion in a spherical pattern. And this idea is going to continue into the Aristotelian framework that's going to really dominate the scene, moving all the way up to the Copernican revolution. And so the world moves in imperfect approximation of this eternal reality, the eternal realm of ideals that the craftsman applies to that which is otherwise formless and void. And then, of course, let's look over to the biblical creation account, where we're told, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. And then God goes forth, ordering this world in accordance with the true word. He says, let there be, and then there was. Let there be, and then there was. Or as we get at the beginning of the Gospel of John, in arche hen hologos kai hologos hen prostontheon. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. All things were made through the Word. And so it is through the true Word that which is formless and void is made to be in form. Now, the exact details of all these stories are indeed different. And so I don't mean to say that these are all the same story. They're not, but my point is that there are some thematic similarities in a broad range of creation accounts. Now, some major differences is that in the Babylonian account, we have these two primordial realities, but we don't get a firm, intentional creation. It's sort of like, these things, they come together and they end up just sort of producing this world of conflict, and out of this conflict, we eventually get the world as we know it. That's very different than the biblical creation account, in which there's not really a conflict, right? God just does stuff, right? God says, let there be, and then there is. And so this is more of an account of creation rather than a story that happens to have led to creation, right? There's a difference there. Now, I would say that in this Elder Scrolls world, what we get here at the very beginning with this interplay of order and chaos, it's probably most similar out of these three that I've laid out, the Babylonian account, the Platonic account, and the biblical account. I would say this is probably closest to the Babylonian account, where you have these primordial forces of order as such, chaos as such, just sort of mixing together, and through this mixture of the movement of chaos and the form of order, we end up getting the structured reality in which everything else takes place. All right, let's go just a little bit further here before I interrupt myself again. Desiring to reflect upon himself with consciousness, Anu projected forth from his own being a soul, which was named Anuiel, the everlasting light and the soul of all things. Padomay did likewise, and thus came to be Sithis, the nothingness, the void, and as some would know him, the Dread Father. Now with this emanation concept, a couple things come into mind. First of all, we have Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism is not an organized religion as such. By its nature, it's kind of decentralized. And so there are different Gnostic teaching, different Gnostic visions of cosmology, creation and all that. But the primary idea is that you have, at the root of existence, you have the monad, or the one. You have one thing. And then out of this one thing, you get the emanations known as the aeons. These aeons, maybe we could call them gods, maybe not, but they're divine realities that are not entirely distinct from the monad, but they are sort of these, picture like a tiered fountain where water bubbles up and then comes back down. We can talk about different levels of the fountain, but it's all the same fountain. That's kind of what's happening here, where the gods, these aeons, are that which just sort of bubble up from the monad, from the one. And eventually we get to the aeon known as Sophia, or wisdom. And, we think the wisdom, wisdom knows what to do, obviously. That's kind of what wisdom means, is that which knows what is, and that which is best, that which is the best course of action. But part of Sophia in this understanding is, it's a kind of curiosity, right? It's a desire to know that which it doesn't yet know. And Sophia, in particular, wants to know creation. It wants to imitate that out of which Sophia originates. It wants to imitate the creation that comes out of the monad. And so out of herself, Sophia creates the demiurge, which is sometimes identified with the God of the Old Testament, because this is the deity that is chiefly responsible for creating the material world, which in the Gnostic understanding is itself a fall. It is a misstep. It is something that should not have happened, because the monad, which is pure spirit, is good. And so the further away we get from that goodness, a purity of spirit, the more that we are falling into corruption, the more that we're approaching, the void, the more that we're approaching chaos, that which is undifferentiated, that which doesn't properly belong to the monad, that which is nothing. And so the material world it's an approach toward nothingness, an approach toward the void. And so Sophia, because of its responsibility in leading to this creation, Sophia gets trapped within this material world order, and then has to undergo a process of redemption, because there's still a divinity, there's still spirit that works through this material world, this material order, because, ultimately, all things that do exist, to the extent that they do exist within the monad who is spirit. And so this includes humanity who has a spark of the divine, despite the fact that we are trapped and we are corrupted by this material form. And so there are a number of different kinds of Christian heresies that draw on this Gnostic idea to say that Jesus is an incarnation of Sophia or a messenger of Sophia in order to provide us with this knowledge of our true spiritual identity in a way that allow us to transcend the mortal flesh, transcend our limitations, and reapproach the monad and eventually get reincorporated into the monad fully. And so again, there are various ways of understanding Gnosticism, but this is the general trajectory. And we definitely see elements of this in the Elder Scrolls creation account. There's no doubt about that we see traces of that there. Now, we could also talk about a kind of a related philosophical approach, that of Neoplatonism, which also deals with this idea of emanation. Now, Neoplatonism really hits its stride in the first few centuries AD, especially leading up to Augustine, who's going to make substantial use of Neoplatonic models, but he's going to baptize them within the context of Christianity. Now, what is Neoplatonism? Well, Neoplatonism, in its original pagan context, draws, as you would expect, on Plato, sort of filtered through Aristotle, as well as a number of other philosophies that it's gained along the way. And it also makes use of this emanation idea. Now, in Neoplatonism, going to the likes of Plotinus, Plotinus refers to what we would chiefly refer to God and his system as the One. So again, we're dealing with a monad, we're dealing with a one, we're dealing with a kind of pantheism here in which all things are God in a sense. All things emanate from God. They're not truly distinct from God. And so out of the one, again, we get bubbling out these divine things. We get bubbling out these emanations. The first emanation, according to the Neoplatonic model, and we also find this in the Middle Platonism of the likes of Philo of Alexandria, this idea that the first emanation out of the one is the Logos, the Word. This might even be identified with Plato's forms. Certainly, there are some connections here with the Christian idea of the Logos, but we do want to differentiate those ideas because in the Christian understanding, the Logos is truly God. He is, as the creeds say, very God of very God. He is homoousios with the Father. He is of the same substance. And so the Christian Logos, who is incarnated as the man Jesus Christ, is of the same substance of God. He is not an emanation of God. He is not lesser than God. Well, the Neoplatonic Logos is an emanation, and so in so doing, he is one step removed from the one itself, the sort of the central reality that is. And then from the Logos, we get spirit and so forth, and eventually we get down to the material plane, which is just on the kind of the border of non-existence. And so we as spiritual beings who are by nature attached to the material world, we have this dual reality within us, where on one hand we can direct ourselves toward material things, and in so doing we are approaching the non-existence that is implicit in material reality, or we can direct ourselves toward spiritual things, toward the life of the mind, toward ultimately in the direction of the monad, and in so doing we achieve this harmony between ourselves and fundamental reality. And this can present itself as a kind of mysticism. It can present itself as a kind of spiritual euphoria when we achieve this sort of transcendence by so identifying ourselves with not even that which is reasonable, that which is rational, but that which stands above and beyond reason itself. Which is a Platonic idea, because I mean, if we say that reason is good, then what we mean is that whatever reason is, it participates in the idea of goodness, which must come before reason. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to say that reason participates in goodness. So whatever goodness is, stands above and beyond what we can rationally understand. And so for the Neoplatonists, the kind of ideal spiritual orientation or the ideal spiritual state is in perfect union with that which stands even above reason. And so the life of the mind is good, but it's not ultimate. The ultimate good is achieved through this transcendence that involves this sort of euphoric, mystical encounter with the one that stands above and beyond what rationality can comprehend, what rationality can achieve. And so we definitely see some of these Neoplatonic ideas playing out here in this entire mythological narrative that's playing out here. And so between this order-chaos dialectic that I brought up and the Neoplatonic and Gnostic ideas of creation and redemption, like we're going to see a lot of these ideas play out as we continue forward. All right, let's keep going. Through the order-chaos dialectic of Anuiel and Sithis, the Grey Center, or Orbis, was made. This ambiguous creation is the womb of worlds that would give rise to the planes of Aetherius, Oblivion, and eventually the mortal realm of Mundus, as well as those that would inhabit them. As with many aspects of this mythology, it is debatable whether Anuiel or Sithis are principally responsible for the creation of Orbis. Many cultures honor Anuiel for his active role in creation, but he is often seen as a catalyst rather than the principal actor. As it is written in Monomyth, Sithis is held in highest esteem because he is the one that causes the reaction. Sithis is thus the original creator, an entity who intrinsically causes change without design. Even the Hist acknowledge this being. Being an emanation of order, Anuiel is associated with stability, which changes not. Sithis, however, as an emanation of chaos, is associated with change, and never has there been a greater change than the beginning of the cosmos that previously was not. However, the formation of new things requires form, which is supplied by Anuiel. Thus Sithis is the active agent of creation, although Anuiel is its order and its life. Alright, so some interesting things are happening here regarding the relationship between order and chaos, especially regarding agency, right? Who is moving first? Who is principally responsible for change, for causing things to be? Now, in the myth at hand from the Elder Scrolls, we're told that most cultures see Sithis as the primary creator, because he is somebody who intrinsically causes change, right? He's chaotic. To be in chaos is to be in continual flux. And so it kind of makes sense that you might say that, okay, Sithis has the active role here, as opposed to Anuiel, who's associated with order. Order is associated with stability. Stability doesn't move. And so it kind of makes sense that you might say that Sithis is moving, but because Sithis is chaotic, any kind of creation is going to require the form that Anuiel supplies within his ordered stability. But see, here's the problem. Can chaos as such have that kind of intentionality? It seems like to have that sort of intentionality, it would have to first have, intention. It would have to have order. And where does that order come from if Sithis is born entirely out of the void, or actually not even born, right? Because that implies distinction. But Sithis emanates from the void. Sithis emanates from chaos. And so Sithis itself must be chaos, unless, of course, it somehow shares in the order of Anu, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. And so in my reckoning, this is actually a flaw in the myth. Now, it is true that the sequence of initiation and reception is not really laid out clearly in the Babylonian Enuma Elish either, but in that myth, remember Apsu, who's associated with order, is masculine. Tiamat, who is associated with chaos, is feminine. And so there is a natural relationship that's implicit in that myth within those gender roles. That one provides, the other receives, that gives rise to new life. And so it's implied there that order moves to chaos, that produces new life. In the Genesis account, God initiates through the true word applied to that which is formless and void, that brings forth ordered creation. In Plato's myth, chaos doesn't have intentionality, right? That's what it means to be chaotic. There is no implicit intention. And so God, the craftsman, applies order to the chaos, and thereby creates ordered reality. And so in all three of these myths that I've been talking about, and by the way, I should clarify, when I say myth, I don't mean something's not true, all right? Nor am I even putting all these on the same level. And so these are all just stories about how the world came to be. That doesn't mean I'm putting them on the same level. That being said, in all of these stories, all these creation myths, you have order applying itself to chaos because order has intentionality, whereas chaos simply cannot. Now, the problem that perhaps the writers of the Elder Scrolls are trying to deal with here is, again, how do we get movement, right? Movement belongs to chaos, so how do we get change? And they assume that must come through the agency of chaos, because, again, chaos is what changes. However, what I don't think they recognize here is the relationship between time and eternity. So even Plato and even Aristotle, who in many ways takes Plato's creation model, I mean, he adapts it to his own system, but functionally there's a lot of similarity at play here. And what Plato and especially Aristotle maintain is that the world itself is eternal, even though it's ontologically dependent on that which orders it, on that which sustains it. And even in a Christian understanding, I mean, go to the likes of Boethius, the Roman Christian philosopher, who says that the eternality of God is related to time as if God were occupying all of time simultaneously. And so you could think of what we would call the timeline of world history is for God a single time point. It is the entirety of time experienced as a simultaneous present. And so what that means is that God, who is fully actualized, can be active precisely because he is eternally active. Meaning never is there a point that God begins to act, because from the perspective of eternity, God is always doing everything that God has always been doing, always will be doing, and always is doing, as we would approach it from our perspective. And so that is why God can have perfect order, perfect stability, but also have effects within time. And it seems like in this Elder Scrolls myth that they're trying to kind of approach eternity as if it were a firm timeline, despite the fact that, as we're going to see in just a little bit, time hasn't even been introduced yet. And so it seems like they're trying to solve a problem that they've actually already solved, precisely because we are not yet dealing with time. And so all of that to say that in giving Sithis agency as the original creator, I think that they're getting something wrong. Now, that might seem like a weird thing to say in a fictional account of a video game creation story, but I would say the same thing if we're dealing with a myth that somebody in our primary world has espoused at some point in history, right? I would say that this is a point at which the myth is wrong, in that chaos doesn't produce order, but order can bring that which is formless and void into a state of ordered being, or at least say becoming that's approaching being. Now, of course, one value of giving us this myth from in-universe sources is that we could say that maybe some of these in-universe sources got the real myth wrong, right? That's some flexibility we have in dealing with this kind of media. All right, now let's continue. Within Arbus came further emanations from Anuiel and Sithis. From Anuiel came Ariel, also known as Akatosh, the dragon god, chief god of the divines and lord of time, which he gave to Arbus to provide stability in sequence. As the Aldmer would say, Ariel bled through Arbus as a new force called time. With time, various aspects of the Arbus began to understand their natures and limitations. Now again, this could be an interesting mechanic when we only at this point have the introduction of time, but it kind of seems like functionally they've already included time, and we look at what time does. So again, just to reiterate, I feel like there is a misstep at play here. Alright, let's continue. With this new stability came the host of original spirits, or the Aedra, which would become the Aedra and the Daedra, depending on whether they were attached to the light of Anu or the void of Padomay. From Sithis came forth the emanation that would be known as Lorkhan, the missing god. Lorkhan was, at least for a time, more of a limit than a nature, so he can never last long anywhere. As he entered every aspect of Anuiel, Lorkhan would plant an idea that was almost wholly based on limitation. He outlined a plan to create a soul for the Arbus, a place where the aspects of aspects might be allowed to self-reflect. He gained many allies, including Ariel, and so they created Mundus. So it definitely seems like we have some Gnosticism at play here, with Lorkhan serving the role of the demiurge in creating the material world, or in this case, inciting the creation of the material world. But again, just as they have Sithis sort of incite creation by means of Anuiel, here Lorkhan does the same thing by means of Ariel. And note that this is going to require great sacrifice, even as the Gnostic Sophia had to sacrifice some of its power and became constrained within this material world that it caused. However, a key difference here, remember that Sophia is an emanation of the monad, of the one, of being itself, whereas Lorkhan is an emanation of Sithis, who is an emanation of Padomay. So again, the question ought to be asked, like, where is this intentionality coming from? Where is this ordered thinking coming from? Now, I think it could be argued that at this point, as we get further and further emanations, as everything's sort of getting mixed together, that even if Lorkhan is an emanation of Sithis, maybe Lorkhan does have some kind of interplay with the order that is emanating out from Anu to Anuiel to Ariel. Like maybe there is some borrowed order here at this point. I could accept that a lot faster than I could accept the ordered mind of Sithis that we were already given. However, we're also going to come to find that maybe this isn't a Gnostic demiurge thing, that this is only one possible interpretation of what's happening. But we'll save that for just a moment from now. Let's keep going. Now, the peoples of Tamriel do not agree on the intentions or justifications with which Lorkhan incited the creation of Mundus, whether the limitations of the mortal realm were intended to be a boon for reflection and transcendence, or whether this was an attempt to weaken the gods, and so move Arbus back toward the void of which Lorkhan himself was born. These contrasting theologies give rise to the hostility that is often found between men and elves. The men of Cyrodiil, who know Lorkhan as Shazar, write in Shazar's song, Shazar spoke beautifully of creation and the ennoblement of sacrifice, inciting the Aedra to create the mortal world. However, this creation left them weakened and angry at their lessened state. These gods of the elves vowed vengeance upon Shazar and his enemies, and encouraged the elves to be stoic against the harshness of mortality. Yet other Aedra, the gods of men and beastfolk, led by Akatosh, praised and cherished their wards, the mortal races, and said unto each other, Let us teach the mortal races to live well, to cherish beauty and honor, and to love one another as we love them. Thus the gods of men, often known as the divines, were tender and patient, and thus are the men and beastfolk great in heart or joy or suffering, and ambitious for greater wisdom and a better world. Thus men often praise Lorkhan, viewing the creation of Mundus as a divine mercy, an enlightenment whereby lesser creatures can reach immortality. The Aldmer, however, tend to view this act of creation as a trick that sundered their connection to the spirit plane. For, while men understand that they were created by the gods, the Aldmer believe that they are actually descended from the gods, and thereby share, to some degree, in the essence of divinity. Thus, the weakening of the gods is understood personally, and their mortal frame is despised as a lesser state of being than the rights of their nature would grant. So there we have it. Maybe Lorkhan is this demiurge figure, this aspect of an aeon, who sins by inciting the creation of the material mortal world. Like, maybe that's the case. Or maybe Lorkhan, out of love, out of a desire for greatness, incited the creation of the mortal world so that there could be mortals that the gods could shepherd and raise up out of the muck, out of the sort of dirt of mortal existence, and rise to something greater. And maybe even the gods themselves could transcend their station as they enter into the limitations of the material world, that actually provides a greater means of transcendence through the upward motion of overcoming those limitations. Like, maybe that's the case. Now, however we frame this, it seems clear that we're to understand there's something inherently vulgar about this material mortal world. And now, that's kind of tough to deal with. It's tough to analyze. Because on one hand, that there is this Gnostic idea that matter is inherently evil. And then in Christian thought, we get the idea that the material world is ontologically dependent on metaphysical realities and ultimately on God, who is spirit. But at the same time, we aren't told that matter is inherently wrong, matter is not inherently evil, it's not inherently wicked. It's not even something that ultimately Christians expect to be freed from. That the new creation is just that. It's a union and a reformation of heaven and earth doesn't lose its earthliness. You look at the gospel accounts of the risen Christ, and he eats in order to demonstrate that he has a real physical body. And so the Christian hope is the full integration of spirit and matter in the way that it ought to be. And so matter for Christian thought is not bad. At the same time, it's clear that spirit has a metaphysical and an ontological priority relative to matter. As Psyche says in C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces, would not a dream feel shame if it were walking about in the waking world? There's nothing wrong with being material, but matter is, in a certain sense, and I want to be clear about that, in a certain sense, matter is less than spirit. So there we have it. Maybe Lorkhan is this trickster god who tricks the gods into creating the material world in order to lessen them, in order to draw them off into the void. In that case, he's sort of like a Gnostic Satan figure, right? In that he lures the gods towards the limitations of the material mortal plane as a way of constraining them, as a way of lessening their divinity, a way of making them more vulgar, and thereby drawing them further and further back toward the void, of which Lorkhan was ultimately born. And so that would kind of make him this trickster god, as well as this Gnostic demiurge kind of figure. Or maybe Lorkhan had good intentions, right? Maybe Lorkhan wanted to create mortals so that they could be shepherded by the gods and that they could rise up out of their station and participate in the great dance of the cosmos. Maybe that is the case, but it definitely does seem like in either situation, the material world is being framed as a bad thing that ought to be escaped from. And that's definitely a Gnostic idea. Now, at the same time, we're told that the limitations of this material world could potentially provide a means of a greater transcendence, even for the gods. Like, obviously, for mortals who don't exist, well, it's better for them to exist and then to transcend that sort of inferior existence. But even for the gods, there's this idea that, okay, well, maybe the limitations imposed upon their existence in the material sphere can allow them to learn how to transcend those limitations. And through that upward movement of transcendence, they can actually become something even greater than they were originally. And so even though the ontology here seems to be very Gnostic, I would argue that in some of these directional movements, in some of the process here, we have something like a Felix Culpa theology at play here, or a happy fall idea. This is the idea that even though the sin of the first humans was obviously a bad thing, right? Sin is never good. At the same time, it provided the conditions for the incarnation of Christ. It provided the means of our increased station in relation to God by means of the gospel of Christ, right? Perhaps if we never sinned, if humanity never fell from grace, then there wouldn't be an incarnation. If there wasn't an incarnation, then we would never be glorified to the extent that the Christian gospel proclaims. And so even though the fall was a bad thing, it ultimately serves a good purpose in the course of redemptive history. And so there is a greater grace that comes precisely because of our great fall. And I would say that that kind of idea seems to be at play here, that the limitations of the material world may be a bad thing, but it's a bad thing that can lead to a greater good. And so again, I think the best way to frame this myth is probably with Gnosticism, but at the same time, there are some elements of historical Christian thought that are definitely at play here as well. All right, well, let's go ahead and continue. Regardless of Lorkhan's intentions, many of the great spirits willingly underwent the sacrifice that would be required in establishing the mortal realm. Many of the Aedra vanished completely with this act. Some escaped, like Magnus, and that is why there are no limitations to magic. Ifri transformed into Eonofre, the earth bones, so the whole world might not die. Okay, so this is kind of interesting, and again, it demonstrates the fact that we're dealing with a number of different ideas and mythologies and philosophies all sort of meshed in together here. And so here we have this idea that in the very fibers of creation, we have evidence of divine condescension, that the gods truly do care about us, about this mortal world, even to the point of undergoing great sacrifice that we might have life and that this world might be preserved. And that is an idea that I think could be very consonant with Christian theology. Now, obviously, we're talking about gods, right? This is a polytheistic context, but nonetheless, in this idea that the world itself is held together out of divine grace. Like, this world is fundamentally good. It's held together with love. It's held together with grace, a kind of love and grace that summons us up to higher realities, to rise out of the mundane of mundus in the direction of divine realities. These are ideas very consonant with a Christian understanding of what the world fundamentally is. This is a world held together by love, by grace, by the will of God, that we might seek after him, and that our souls will be cultivated toward higher reality. All right, let's keep going. And according to the Aldmer, some married, and each generation of children was weaker until they became the Aldmer. And if you haven't caught it, the Aldmer are definitely Gnostics, or at the very least Neoplatonists, believing that our own divine essence is ultimately traced back an emanation of the monad. And so our goal is to despise and to shake off these vulgar limitations of our mortal frame and to reascend and to join together with the monad that undergirds higher reality. The Daedra mock the Aedra for their sacrifice in the creation of a world that is in its essence other than what they are, and they instead created a world within themselves, to be forever theirs and under their complete control. However, the greater Daedra often found the passions and ambitions of mortals to be more entertaining than that of the lesser Daedra, and thus they often sought to court and to seduce certain amusing specimens of the mortal races, especially the passionate and the powerful. The Daedra lords reveled in taking the best of mortals, thereby demonstrating the preferability of Daedric glory and power to the feeble vulgarity of the Aedra. Alright, so when we look at the difference between the Aedra and the Daedra, we definitely see a kind of Christian moral framework at play here, where you might expect, given the aesthetics of this creation account, you might expect more of a pagan kind of morality. But no, what we see here is that the Aedra are given over to sacrifice, and they cultivate within their followers charity and justice and love and these sorts of things, these virtues, faith, hope, and love, the cardinal spiritual virtues. Whereas the Daedra are insular, right? They create a realm that allows them to be autonomous. They're not given over to sacrifice. They're interested in pagan power, right? They're interested in pagan understandings of greatness that Christianity critiques and tends to subvert or invert. And so the demons of the Elder Scrolls cosmos are, they're demons. Instead of producing and uplifting, they seek to consume, they seek to make thralls. They don't make people more themselves, but they make people more their own. And so, Arbus continues to be the gray center, the meeting place of order and chaos, of being and void, of Aetherius and oblivion. The limitations of the mortal plane may either be a vile trick of a nefarious god bent on returning all things to darkness, or they may be due to an act of divine beneficence by which mortals, and even gods, might achieve higher transcendence through the reflection made possible only by such limitations. For it is only through the limitations of being that transcendence might be made possible. And now let us end with a summary of such things found in the anonymously written Spirit of Nirn. Some wish to return to the original state, the spirit realm, and believe that Lorkhan is the demon that hinders their way. To them, Nirn is a prison, an illusion to escape. Others think that Lorkhan created the world as a testing ground for transcendence. To them, the spirit realm was already a prison, and that true escape is now finally possible. Regardless of how one views this act of creation, the creation of the mortal plane, the Mundus, Nirn, is a source of mental anguish to all living things. All souls know deep down that they came originally from somewhere else, and that Nirn is a cruel and crucial step to what comes next. Here we have an idea that can still fit within the Gnostic framework or even the Neoplatonism, but I think can be most directly attributed to Plato proper. In his dialogue The Phaedo, in which he is detailing the conversation leading up to the death of Socrates, Socrates makes the point that we all have certain desires that this world cannot satisfy. We all long to return to the realm of the ideals, the way that things ought to be in their purest form. We long for beauty itself. I mean, for example, have you ever experienced something just so overwhelmingly beautiful? Maybe just a particularly glorious sunrise or sunset or work of art, or maybe your bride on your wedding day, or whatever. You experience something that is just so overwhelmingly beautiful that it almost gives you a kind of pain, a kind of longing, because whatever it is that you're experiencing, you want more of that. You want to experience beauty as such, beauty in its fullness, its most ideal state. Well, Plato argues that the reason why we have these desires for perfect justice, right, for all sorts of things that we're never going to be able to experience fully in this world, is because part of us by nature belongs to another world. And this is part of his argument as to why we can rationally believe, based off human experience and a number of different factors. He's arguing in the Phaedo that there's rational reason to believe that our souls endure past death because they properly belong somewhere else. And of course, C.S. Lewis makes a very similar kind of argument, very intentionally similar, in Mere Christianity, in which he argues that just as our thirst gives us good reason to believe there is such a thing as drink, our hunger gives us good reason to believe there is such a thing as food, so too our deep spiritual desires that cannot be fully satisfied in this world give us good reason to believe that there is another world to which we properly belong. As Psyche says until we have faces, as she believes she is approaching death, she says, "Do you think it all meant nothing? All the longing for home, for indeed it now feels not like going, but like going back." Lewis says in Surprised by Joy that it is in his greatest joys, and this is echoed with Psyche until we have faces, but he says that in his greatest joys, that's when he most wishes for death, not out of depression, not out of despair, not out of abandonment of life and meaning, but out of this deep conviction, this deep understanding that this world, at least in its present state, is not truly our home. We properly belong somewhere else. And so what we see here is that, yes, in this broad cosmological framework that we get in this Elder Scrolls creation myth, it's very much shaped by Gnosticism, by pagan mythology, by certain Neoplatonic elements, but they're also very Platonic and very Christian ideas all mixed in here. And so we're dealing with a hodgepodge of ideas, which is to be fairly expected when we're dealing with a fictional creation account operating in a world that has appreciation for the pagan past, but has been very much saturated with Christian ideas. And so all this is sort of mixed together here. And it is worth reiterating that this Elder Scrolls myth that we're given, it comes to us in universe by conflicting sources, as I've already mentioned. And so, that kind of accounts for some of the haphazard nature here, the fact that not not everything seems to perfectly fit together, because that's exactly what you would expect from this sort of storytelling angle. And this also gives us a kind of freedom here, in that, we sort of putting ourselves in universe can say that, like, we can question some of these sources and say that maybe this isn't the true story, right? There's room for doing that in universe, for critiquing the story, saying maybe it didn't happen exactly this way. But at the same time, this does give us some positive elements here, some things to aspire to. And so, maybe the elves are right, maybe the Aldmer are right in saying that this world is essentially a mistake. It never should have been, and that the best we can do is to get ourselves out of this mess, transcend and go back to the spirit realm. Or maybe more truth resides with the men and the beast folk, who say that this world is a staging ground for what comes next, and so we need to prepare ourselves accordingly, live in accordance with justice and charity and virtue of various kinds, and so that way we can transcend the limitations of vulgarity and ascend to something greater, a higher way of life that lets our rational rather than our beastly soul lead the way. And so there's a lot that we can do with this, but I hope this was helpful, and I really look forward to continuing moving forward as we take a philosophical lens toward the Elder Scrolls universe, toward plots and different things that exist within this cosmos. Some of what we do moving forward will be kind of metaphysical and esoteric, like what we're doing right now, but a lot of it's going to be a lot more concrete, because, the reality is a lot of what we're talking about right now and similar topics, they operate on the periphery. The writers thought that it was important to include it, and obviously this has some effect on the way that things are shaped on the smaller scale, but at the same time, once you're actually playing the games, a lot of this is not really explicit, and so we'll be taking a high perspective as well as a more focused perspective moving forward. This is the last video that, at least for now, that I am publicly posting on the Elder Scrolls and philosophy. And so again, if you want to join us, then head over to patreon.com/mythicmind, become a tier 3 patron, and that will give you access to the course. We are beginning this course officially on the week of October 19th, 2025. And so go ahead and join now if you're watching this soon after it's posted, so that way you can join with us live. Now, if you join late, that's okay. If you watch this, a while down the road, you can still become a patron and get access to the material, but it's a lot more fun if you can join us live. But that's it for now. Until next time, Godspeed.